Greg and I have camped, that is, tented, our way through much of Europe in various trips. COVID and the high probability of lost luggage, you recall those days, kind of ended that. We may go back to it, I don't know. A number of summers ago, we toured around Belgium. I loved Belgium's historic centers, especially Bruges, Antwerp, Ghent. We had an unforgettable nighttime adventure in a campground in a suburb of Ghent. We were awakened in the middle of the night by some vigorous banging and crashing sounds. We were somewhat discombobulated. Who would be working at some kind of job at 2:30 in the morning? How could they see? Of course, criminal activity didn't occur to us. We went back to sleep. In the morning, Greg went for his usual morning run. Police were at the camp office. Campground staff were standing around greatly distressed. There'd been a nighttime break-in, and the smashing we heard were the office doors and the safe, everything being smashed into. The poor night security guard had been tied up. I think he survived that experience. It was a nighttime visitation I shall never forget, long after I've dropped some other memories overboard. And that day is coming too. Today's lectionary text from the Hebrew Scriptures is a nighttime visitation, not a break-in, but perhaps an in-breaking. The famous prophetic call story when the boy Samuel hears and listens to the voice of God. The trouble with these kinds of stories that we've heard from our childhood, we get listener fatigue. We could possibly say them verbatim. But I reply, we contend with the Scriptures not to defeat them, but to bring them to life. Samuel's unusual nighttime call had enormous significance for his life. It determined his life course, in fact. Many biblical characters have received a dramatic call of some kind. God's call to Abraham, Moses at the burning bush, Elijah at the cave in Horeb, Ezekiel's fiery wheel, Jeremiah. Isaiah's vision in the temple is perhaps most famous. I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. And into the Christian era, Francis of Assisi, early 13th century, had a great vision while praying in a ruined church. Thomas Aquinas, Dante, Catherine of Siena, and on, and into our time, of course, too. The child Samuel was a special provision from God, not only for childless Hannah and her husband Elkanah, but for Israel itself. When Samuel was weaned, Hannah brought him to the ancient cultic center at Shiloh, the last great center of Israelite worship before the monarchy began. She dedicated Samuel and left him there with old Eli, the ruler. Samuel's call is told in the third person. The text says, now the boy was ministering to the Lord under Eli. That's an unusual beginning for a story. In the Scriptures, God is often said to be with a particular individual, but here we have a complete reversal. A young boy ministering to the Lord under Eli. It seems like a deliberate selection of words by the storyteller. Even as a child, Samuel is characterized as a priest, ministering to Yahweh and clothed in sacerdotal, that is, priestly garments. The editorial technique seems clear. This auspicious beginning about Samuel will provide a framework within which the depravity of Eli's sons is arranged. Their evil is set in greater relief by implicit contrast with this young boy. The text says the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. This is a poignant statement of Israel's sorry plight. The word of Yahweh was a highly valued piece of communication. At the time of the events described, the oracle had become infrequent. Notice the setting of intent here. What will follow is out of the ordinary. Eli's eyesight had begun to grow dim. The coming vision will be an apparition, a visual display, as well as an audible voice that Eli will be unable to witness. Samuel's call will be a seeing and a hearing. Otherwise, Eli's dim eyesight, it seems to me, would not be significant. It wouldn't be mentioned. Verse 3, the lamp of God had not yet gone out, is, I think, a poetic way of suggesting it was nearly but not quite dawn. According to priestly regulation, the lamps burned in the sanctuary evening until morning. The revelation to Samuel took place probably just before light. Like Isaiah's great revelation, this vision occurred in the temple. Verse 3, Samuel was lying down within the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. The ark was a central object of Israelite worship. Yahweh was especially present there. Eli was in his usual place in the vestibule, Samuel in the nave with the door closed, lying near the ark. 3 times God calls, Samuel, Samuel. He jumps up, heads to where Eli is sleeping in the vestibule, and says, Here I am, you called me. The latter part of verse 8 is poignant. Eli perceived that God was calling the boy. Eli seems to be a rather helpless onlooker, but now he gets it, finally, and he instructs Samuel about what to do when Yahweh calls next. Verse 10 can give us goosebumps. The Lord came and stood forth, calling as at other times. The Lord came and stood forth. Samuel, Samuel. What a visual that is. Samuel becomes the mouthpiece through which God's will is communicated. But what a sorrowful message. We did not read the remaining verses of this story, but they say, I am about to do a thing in Israel at which the 2 ears of everyone that hears it will tingle. I am about to punish Eli's house forever. Eli's sons were blaspheming God, we're not told how, and Eli did not restrain them. There's no suggestion that Eli himself was wicked. He was well-intentioned, but somewhat ineffectual. Eli's failure to restrain his dissolute sons was cause for God's rejection of his house. Saul and his succession is put aside by God. Why didn't Eli come running to hear the message? I should think he would be bursting with curiosity. Perhaps not. Truth is demanding. Eli must have known it was bad news. Verse 18, which we also didn't read, Samuel told Eli everything. Eli said, It is the Lord, let him do what seems good to him. Eli is a rather tragicomic figure. He recognizes the truth and responds with stolid piety. There's no evil in Eli, but neither is there any strength. He receives the terrible news in a certain passivity. The consequences of the mischief at Shiloh are dire. Yahweh has chosen a new faithful priest to do his bidding, and it proves to be Samuel himself. The apprentice will replace the master. The tragedy of Eli and his family unfolds in subsequent chapters, but this episode is the beginning of the tragedy. The old priest must prepare for his own downfall. The defeat of Israel, the sack of Shiloh by the Philistines, the terrible loss of the ark, the deaths of Eli's sons and Eli himself, the end of the priesthood of Aaron. Verse 19 says, "And Samuel grew, and Yahweh was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground." This Hebrew expression means that Samuel was effective. Everything he said proved true. High accolades indeed. Samuel became a great man of God, held in honor, a judge and political leader who dispensed justice with integrity. Samuel's important life work now lay ahead of him. That night vision was the end of Samuel's childhood. A boy who grew up in Yahweh's service became the prophet whose word guided all of Israel. He became a national figure. What was implied had been made explicit. Samuel had risen to the very office from which he had been prepared from the womb. What about a call in our time? Many people of faith would say God calls us through intuitions, through intimations, nudgings, every bit as real as if they had been articulated audibly. Perhaps we're not accustomed to paying attention. So often we come to God as beggars. We ask and wheedle, "Oh, give me, bless me, help me, guide me, grant me this and that." It's good to be alone and listen. Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes in Life Together, "Let him who cannot be alone beware of community. Alone you stand before God when God calls you. You alone must answer that call. You cannot escape from yourself, for God has called you. Speak, Lord, for your servant is paying attention." When God calls us his busy servants, shall we hear? We will always live with distractions. The late Henry Nouwen said, "I used to complain that my work was constantly interrupted until I began to see that the interruptions were my work." Yet life now seems to be different in degree and in kind from before. We're always running, like squirrels on a wheel, or we're in a mill race, flailing and thrashing against the possibility of drowning. Or we sit in slack-jawed incomprehension at the daily news, detailing the dark off-roads of human behavior, a seeming collapse of civility, an aggressive social insolence, an abrasive patriotism, particularly to the south of us, erasure of the truth. We all feel kind of beige, or like we're being hauled through a hedge, backwards. There's the new trinity we hear about in schools every day: fear, anxiety, stress. Hopes crushed to many pieces. And for our world, the warning lights of limits are definitely coming on. Maybe you're not hearing any particular call at all on this snowy January day. Perhaps we feel like writer Anne Lamott, who says she often says to God when she hears of some fresh new debacle, "God, you've got to be kidding." Doesn't that sound like Anne Lamott? God, you've got to be kidding. I also note we're the most fortunate generation that ever lived. We've changed the way the world works, but we rarely think about it. We've created problems that we hardly understand, let alone know how to fix. It's the end of our childhoods, so to speak. We naively imagine that some technological deus ex machina, God out of a machine, from the Latin, will save us. Evidence is suggesting nature may not be able to correct or compensate for our misuse. Climate change is probably going to mean an acute and permanent crisis of food and water. Pandemics as public health systems collapse, the desertification of large areas. We must decarbonize our economies, or the second half of this century isn't going to be a very pleasant place to live. Governments will probably be doing triage, deciding who can be saved from engulfment. I suspect our descendants will remember us for our garbage, our pollution, our predation of the earth, until, as writer William Faulkner put it, the last ding-dong of doom. I can think of many things to which we all ought rightly to feel called. I'm sure you can too. Yet, to use baseball thinking, God's grace and mercy is always last at bat. Always. Samuel stayed with his aloneness, and he heard God name him and call him. It proved to be very hard news to bear. God names us and calls us. We have an address, a place with God. The year 2024 stretches before us like a clean sheet. What is your situation calling you to do? May we listen for God's call, however refreshing it may be, or however difficult the hearing. May it be so. Amen.